The man known to history as Nicholas Winton was born to Rudolf Wertheim and Barbara Wertheimer on the 19th of May 1909 in West Hampstead, London. His father, Rudolf, was the son of German immigrants Niklaus and Charlotte, who had settled in Manchester, England shortly after their marriage in 1866. In 1868, Niklaus became a British citizen, and in the 1870s, the couple purchased the house in Hampstead where their grandson would be born. In 1907, Rudolf married Nicholas's mother, Barbara Wertheimer, who came from Nuremberg, and the newlyweds moved into the Hampstead house together, where they enjoyed the trappings of an upper-middle-class London lifestyle. In Hampstead, they became part of a community of affluent and well-educated German Jews who had settled in London in the first half of the 20th century to work as merchant bankers and stockbrokers. However, unlike their friends who retained their Jewish religion, Nicholas's parents decided to raise their children as Christians. Due to his German heritage, at the outbreak of World War I, Rudolf, who changed his second name to the more Anglo-friendly Wortham, was not allowed to join a fighting force and served in a home-based regiment. Following the conclusion of the conflict, Rudolf did not return to the banking sector and instead became a partner in a company that sold Bohemian glass imported from Czechoslovakia. A year after his death, the family surname was fully anglicized when it was formally changed to Winton by deed poll. His mother, Barbara Wertheimer, was born in 1888 and was the daughter of Sigmund Wertheimer, who in 1850 had settled in Nuremberg, an infamously anti-Semitic city which Jews had only recently been permitted to migrate to. Sigmund and his wife Mathilda Lust enjoyed a comfortable life there and had 5 children, all of whom, apart from Winton's mother, stayed in Nazi-controlled Germany until it was no longer safe for Jews. In the lead-up to the First World War, and for its entire duration, a time in which German families were heavily ostracized in Britain, Barbara found it very difficult to cope, for her few friends refused to speak to her until the end of the conflict in 1918. During this challenging period, she was overshadowed by the academic achievements of her high-flying siblings, who included the notable psychiatrists Dr. Ida McAlpine and Dr. Frederick Wortham, and may have developed a sense of being trapped in a domestic environment that did not suit her independent character. As a result, she became bitter and discontented, developing a haughtiness of character that did not inspire friendship. On the other hand, Barbara still possessed a caring streak that was most evident at the outbreak of World War II, when she attentively cared for some of the children that her son had saved. Despite her seriousness, Nicholas Winton remembered his mother as having a very positive outlook on life, and as an extremely intelligent figure who did not like to waste her time with those with little intellectual knowledge or interest. Of her 3 children, Nicholas was her favorite, and no girlfriend, not even his eventual choice of bride, Greta, with whom he had a loving relationship of over 50 years, was quite good enough for her son in her eyes. Nicholas's wife was Greta Gjelstrup, a Danish woman he met in 1948 whilst working for the International Bank in Paris, who unconditionally loved and supported him in the post-war years, particularly from the late 1980s onwards, when he became the center of a media frenzy following a public acknowledgement of his heroic efforts to save Jewish children from the Nazis. Greta had the same virtuous impulse to save those most in need, for during World War II, she had been arrested and imprisoned by the Gestapo as a member of the resistance. With Nicholas, she had 3 children, Barbara, Nicholas, and Robin, the latter of which, disabled from birth, tragically died aged 7 due to complications from Down syndrome, and whose death spurred him to dedicate his later years to MenCap and other charities that helped people with intellectual disabilities. A short, brown-haired, bespectacled man with a fondness for sharp suits. In character, Nicholas Winton was gentlemanly and well-mannered, virtues which came very easily to him as a young man educated at one of Britain's leading private schools, Stowe School. Despite his success in the banking sector, Winton was never attracted to great wealth, never being bothered if a shortness of money prevented him from doing more extravagant things, only enjoying capital when he had it, and turning down many lucrative job offers, since greed and social ambition were never in his nature. Finally, all those who met him were struck by his genuine humility, for throughout his life, Winton, who never liked to be the center of attention, never saw himself as the hero that others viewed him as, and was always eager to highlight the equally impactful role that his colleagues had played in the Kindertransports that would define his legacy. One of Nicholas Winton's earliest memories was of rushing down to the cellar of his Hampstead house and wrapping himself in blankets to the sound of Zeppelin air raids. Although it seemed like a fun adventure to him at the time, it was only later that he understood the situation had been particularly stressful for his parents, who were being shunned at the time because of their German origins. In the first years of his life, Winton enjoyed a comfortable and luxurious upbringing in Hampstead, where his family mingled and socialized with other wealthy German immigrants. However, because his parents decided to baptize him and bring him up as a Christian, they were always viewed with some suspicion by their Jewish neighbors, who couldn't quite understand why they were leaving their ancestral faith behind them. Consequently, as a young boy living in the heart of Jewish London, Winton regularly attended chapel at school and was confirmed. Yet despite this flirtation with Christianity, the family did not want to divorce themselves entirely from their roots, so Nicholas regularly spoke German at home while his parents continued to reside in London's Jewish quarter. Nicholas and his brother Robert began their formal schooling at University College School, a preparatory school where Winton would meet one of his best friends, Stanley Murdoch. In 1923, Murdoch was part of the first intake of boys sent to the newly established Stowe School, with Winton following suit and becoming a boarder after persuading his parents to allow him to join. The first term was especially difficult for Nicholas, who struggled to make friends and to bond with the rather snobbish upper-middle-class pupils that made up the majority of his classmates. Nevertheless, on the sports field, with the help of his teacher, Captain Felix Grave, he excelled at fencing, and in the academic sphere, he was a very talented mathematician, his love of the subject fostered by an inspiring math teacher, Mr. Hexter Smith, who made the world of banking exciting and interesting to him. Aside from this, Nicholas heavily disliked the weekly drill and gun practice organized by the Officers' Training Corps, and was poor at a number of other sports, including cricket, rugby, boxing, and cross-country running. His disdain for army camp, shooting, and many of the more competitive sports perhaps were an early sign of his deep belief in pacifism. Term time was punctuated by visits from his father and mother, who came to see him play sports, while Nicholas also kept up regular correspondence with them, in which he reprimanded his mother if she was tardy in sending letters. He also received presents on his birthday, usually books, and expressed disappointment if an arranged visit was delayed or if a letter had failed to arrive. In his surviving correspondence, the adolescent Nicholas rarely mentions his own feelings, save for a few occasions, such as when he expresses sadness that one of his pet pigeons had died, and when he remarks on the tragedy of trench warfare during a holiday to the battlefields of Belgium. On vacation, he kept busy by playing an assortment of games, including chess with his father and billiards and table tennis with his friends and best pal, Stanley Murdoch, who was one of his most frequent visitors. He also accompanied his mother on shopping sprees to Harrods, joined her for afternoon tea at Gunter's, and watched her and her friends endlessly play bridge. As a family unit, the Wertheims had regular outings to the cinema, theatre, and opera, and when his grandmother from Berlin was in town, she would often take him to the Tate Gallery, a place he found rather boring. His grandmother was also the first person to introduce him to Shakespeare's plays, and as a teen, he would be privileged enough to witness many iconic performances, such as Sybil Thorndike's Lady Macbeth and Tristan and Isolde with Lauritz Melchior and Freda Leider. When he reached 16 years of age, Nicholas began to go to dances and other private functions at the same time that his sister Lottie was sent to Switzerland, a country that her brother would later live in. This was also the age that he began to think about being confirmed as a Christian, a rite of passage that he had to deeply consider before following through with. As a person with Jewish ancestry who had been raised Christian and was looked down upon because of it, he was torn between both as he considered which identity he would choose. After a year of rumination, Nicholas chose to embrace Christianity in both a religious and social sense, opting to marry a Christian girl when the appropriate time came, although he would never become a devout churchgoer. In early 1927, he graduated from Stowe, but without the required grades, which meant that he continued his studies in the evening whilst he served an apprenticeship at the military bank. His father, so often away on business, had sketched out a predetermined career path for his son, who was to go into banking, just like him, an arrangement that Nicholas did not really mind, and which actually suited him, given his aptitude for mathematics. Now legally an adult, Nicholas continued to practice fencing with his dedicated instructor Felix Grave, and voraciously started reading George Bernard Shaw, Coleridge, and other authors, whilst also finding time to learn the Charleston dance. In February 1927, he began working in the city proper for a firm of merchant bankers called S. Yahet, his first job being to manage their internal correspondence, which he carried out between the hours of 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. on weekdays and on Saturday mornings for a salary of £4 per month. On the lunch breaks he shared with his father Nicholas, they discussed city life and how he was finding his new role, and after work it was not uncommon of him to occasionally swim or play squash at the RAC, where his father was a member. Wishing to impress his new bosses, with whom he had little contact, Winton took private lessons and attended a 1-month course at Pitman's to improve his shorthand and typing, all the while keeping up his German in correspondence with his grandmother. At around this time, he also comforted his best friend Stanley Murdoch, whose parents' divorce had led him to believe that the solution was to get a caravan, some books, and live alone. Acting as the voice of reason, Winton implored his friend to reconsider, telling him that all he was doing was running away from the world, in an early indication of his caring nature. In 1929, Winton started writing a diary again, with his first entry describing his attempt to smoke a pipe in order to, in his own words, give one a certain amount of self-confidence and make conversations easy. However, I have a tongue like leather from it. He also recounts a visit from his favorite relative, Aunt Ida, who had recently divorced her husband of 3 years, Ernst Hirschman. He described her as a woman who talks like a steam engine, but it is all perfectly good sense. She radiates happiness, although she's unwell. I think she's very pleased to be here." Now 19, Nicholas began to mention girls a lot more and found himself besotted with Elizabeth O'Malley, who was orphaned as a toddler and taken into the care of one Mr. Sala. With Elizabeth's governess in attendance, they started to meet frequently, with Winton writing in his diary that, "I think she is pretty and certainly interesting." However, just as their relationship was blossoming, Nicholas was sent to Hamburg in June to gain some experience in international banking. Before he left, he said his goodbyes to his friends, family, and of course Elizabeth, writing rather mournfully how, "I shall be sorry to leave Elizabeth, as we have got very friendly in a very short time, and 3 years of correspondence." Heartbroken, on May 20th, 1929, Nicholas left for Berlin with his mother to see his German relatives before he started his new posting in Hamburg. Here Winton began to regularly meet his uncle Paul, the youngest brother of his mother, and a man only 9 years older than him, around 2 to 3 times a week, routinely going out to lunch and dinner with him, taking walks around the city, and accompanying him on excursions to the countryside. On his first day of work at Behrens und Söhne, Nicholas was introduced to the senior partner, Dr. Eberstadt, by his father, while arrangements were made for his son to stay with his acquaintances, Herr and Frau Falk. After an emotional goodbye, his parents returned to London, leaving their son to fend for himself in the adult world. Almost immediately, he befriended the Falks' 18-year-old maid, Gretchen, who helped him practice his German. But he was less enamored by his overly protective hosts, writing in a temporary flight of fancy in August that he was thinking of changing rooms. Nevertheless, left without any better options, he opted to stay with the Falks, developing a lively social life by attending dinner parties, dances, theatre, and opera at the invitation of his parents' friends. As he flourished in Hamburg, he made sure to keep up his correspondence with Elizabeth, while also finding time to pursue new hobbies and interests, chiefly sailing, by becoming a part owner of a boat. Although decrying that the standard was much lower than in London, he continued to fence and was even asked to represent Hamburg in a duel against Copenhagen in a matchup which saw the Danes wipe the floor with their German opponents. Despite the humiliating defeat, Nicholas was inaugurated as a member of the local fencing club, the Hamburger Fechtklub, an honor not usually afforded to foreigners. At Christmas, he returned home to London and was reunited with his love on New Year's Eve at the Dragon, an exclusive night spot. Yet after this, they broke up, and no more is ever heard of Elizabeth. By April 1930, his time in Hamburg was over, and with some reluctance, he moved to Berlin, where he took up employment with another firm, Wassermann's, where the best years of his youth were spent as an apprentice banker. At this point, Hitler had been in power for a couple of years, but Nicholas did not worry himself with politics at this stage, as he engrossed himself in his new role, which included a brief spell working for the Banque Nationale de Crédit in Paris. However, by February 1931, with the Great Depression in full swing and the European economic situation looking gloomy, he was forced to cancel a planned move to New York and was called back to London, where he started to work for the Anglo-Czech Bank and focus his efforts on making an independent living for himself. However, after 3 months there, he was promptly sacked when a promised salary rise failed to materialize, compelling him to take up employment with a more generous bank, namely Ullman and Company. Now 22 and wishing to live separately from his parents, he rented a flat in Belsize Park with his old school pal Stanley Murdoch, taking flying lessons on the side and qualifying as a pilot by 1933. He remained at Ullman's until 1936, when he was headhunted by Cruise and Company, and by 1937 he was admitted as a member of the London Stock Exchange for the princely sum of £2,000. Handed greater responsibilities as he gained experience, Winton was sent to Johannesburg that year to open joint accounts, returning to England with stunning shots of enormous leaping fish, herds of elephants, and other exotic wildlife, to the wonderment of his friends and family back home. In addition, in 1938, after years of hard practice and toil, he was selected for the Olympic fencing team, but this would be cut short by the outbreak of war in 1939. From the mid-1930s, Nicholas could no longer ignore the worsening situation in Germany, as droves of relatives and family friends began to show up at his ancestral Hampstead home, not as temporary guests, but as refugees. Accompanied by his old left-wing schoolmaster Martin Blake, Winton started to familiarize himself with the political developments in Germany by attending meetings at the Peace Pledge Union in Sussex, where he was introduced to several active socialists eager to educate the public on the growing Nazi threat. Used to a family circle that never really discussed politics, he was experiencing a political awakening at this time that burnished a newfound desire to help others in need. As a result of these various influences, Nicholas suddenly felt compelled to make his own political contributions, and just before Christmas, 1938, he was persuaded by Martin Blake, who was unable to give details on the phone, to cancel a planned skiing trip to Switzerland to help him with a far more important matter. Thus, given 2 weeks vacation time by his bosses, he flew out to meet his friend at Hotel Schrobeck in Prague, without any idea of the task he would be undertaking, only knowing it was somehow connected to the growing menace of Nazi Germany. On the evening of the 9th of November, 1938, Jewish homes, businesses, and places of worship in Germany were destroyed. Hundreds were murdered, and thousands were arrested in an event that starkly illustrated that there was no place for Jews in Hitler's Third Reich. The infamous pogrom known as Kristallnacht sent shockwaves throughout Europe, and in particular to Jewish refugees that had fled to the Czech-German border, Sudetenland, a strategically important region that had been handed to the Nazis without a fight following the Munich Conference in September 1938. To the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and his European allies, who sought to use appeasement to forestall Hitler's territorial ambitions, the transfer of Sudetenland to the Nazis had been a political victory and a small price to pay for world peace. Yet for the Jews of Germany and Austria, it had been a concession that had only further endangered the well-being of their people. To them it was obvious which way the wind was blowing, and as a result, groups of German, Austrian, Polish, and Hungarian Jews fled to neighboring Czechoslovakia, with many ending up in and around Prague. 2 months later, with Kristallnacht confirming the greatest fears of the European Jewry, the British government, who had played a major role in the Munich Conference that had spurred the refugee crisis, relaxed its immigration laws, allowing endangered children to enter the country with a simplified travel document. Under the auspices of the Refugee Children's Movement, a subsidiary group of the Central British Fund for World Jewish Relief, and with the support of many voluntary organizations, such as the Quaker Society of Friends, the Jewish Refugee Committee, and the Inter-Aid Committee, a rescue mission known as Operation Kindertransport, which lasted from December 1938 to May 1940, was organized. Stepping off the plane in Prague, Nicholas Winton made his way to Hotel Schrobeck to rendezvous with Martin Blake, an emissary of the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, or BCRC, who filled him in with details of the refugee crisis that had been induced by the Munich Agreement and the disturbing events of Kristallnacht. It soon became apparent to him that Winton had been brought in to organize the mass evacuation not of adults, which the BCRC could already take care of, but of children. Working closely with the head of the overwhelmed and overworked BCRC, Doreen Warriner, Nicholas was struck by the chaos of his surroundings and the huge amounts of people that were relying on the organization to whisk them and their families away to safety. Soon the enormity of his mammoth task began to sink in, with Winton deciding the best course of action was to organizationally unite the 5 Prague committees entrusted with the exodus of Jewish, Catholic, Communist, Austrian, German, and politically exposed writers. With each sect vying for priority and unwilling to cooperate with each other, he knew an essential first step was the creation of a master list that would include the names of all refugees across the board, and from which he could identify the children most in need of help. Employing a little trickery, Nicholas was able to compile it by telephoning all 5 committees and saying that unless they submitted their own list in the next 24 hours, he would only use the lists that had already been given earlier by the other committees. As he tirelessly worked for 18 hours a day, starting as early as 6 a.m. and finishing as late as 1 a.m., Nicholas started to become aware that he was being followed around by Nazi undercover agents. On one occasion, for example, Winton met a woman claiming to work for the Swedish Red Cross, who supposedly had the authority to arrange the transport to Sweden of 20 children daily. Accompanied by Doreen Warriner, as he began to tell the Swedish woman about the nature of his work, he was greeted with a sharp kick from under the table by his boss, who swiftly changed the subject and engaged in small talk until the meeting was over. Afterwards, a brief call to the Swedish embassy revealed that the woman in question was not in their records and was in fact working for the Germans, a reality check which made him a lot more tight-lipped with the information he gave out thereafter. Completely absorbed by his humanitarian purpose, Winton nearly forgot that he had been granted only 2 weeks' leave, prompting him to ask his bosses back in London for an extra week's holiday so he could finish what he had started. He was begrudgingly allowed 10 additional days, and upon his return to London, equipped with hundreds of photos and details of children, he began organizing the actual rescue mission and searching for suitable foster parents. However, Winton was without a major financial backer and was not an official of a large organization, which made it harder for him to convince charities and the government to help him with administration and logistics required to get them over the British border. As such, in order to acquire entry permits for his young refugees, he was forced to undergo a more complicated and time-consuming procedure, which involved submitting a separate application for each child, together with a medical certificate and proof that there was a foster parent willing to look after them until they reached the age of 17. In addition to this, he would have to pay £50 of his own money to cover the cost of the child's eventual post-war return to their homeland or their re-emigration to the Dominions, colonies, or Palestine. Winton's noble endeavour was made even more difficult in April of 1939, when the British government decided to restrict the number of child refugees coming into the country. But with affairs at their bleakest, he was handed a lifeline by a young friend of Martin Blake's, Barbara Willis, who turned up at his door offering her secretarial services and a complete list of all the BCRC's contacts throughout the country. Winton immediately got down to business, writing a letter to each BCRC local branch in which he implored its members to assist him with the evacuation of 500 of the most urgent cases he had compiled whilst in Czechoslovakia. In Winton's own words, the result was astonishing. We were, at last, in business. Employing 4 assistants to share the workload, Winton had cards printed with the photos of 6 children and their names and ages for prospective foster parents to choose from. Once a guardian had been selected, the case was submitted to the Home Office for the issuing of an entry permit, while back in Prague, exit and transit permits would have to be obtained for each child. Entire coaches and trains would have to be booked and paid for, and reliable adults would have to be found to supervise the journey. The first batch of Winton's children left Prague on the 14th of March 1939, one day before the Nazis invaded and occupied what remained of Czechoslovakia. Aware that time was running out, Nicholas redoubled his efforts, forging working partnerships with other voluntary organizations involved in the rescue of German, Austrian, and Czech children of Jewish descent, and placing appeals in newspapers, magazines, on the radio, and at synagogues and churches throughout Britain. At the direction of Winton and the numerous individuals who helped him carry out his master plan, between the 14th of March till the 2nd of August 1939, a total of 8 kinder transports were made that brought 669 imperiled children to the relative safety of Britain. The number does not include the 22 children selected by the Barbican Mission, a Christian organization that Nicholas collaborated with, nor does it contain the 29 children that he helped move to Sweden in the care of a Swedish spy. In fact, it is perfectly possible that Nicholas Winton facilitated the emigration of many more children whose identities have been lost to time, simply because they were unregistered, since many who were saved by him that have been subsequently found did not appear on the official list. Following an intense 8 months of overwhelming physical and emotional pressure, returning to the mundane routine of his banking job was something that Nicholas Winton simply couldn't do, despite assurances from his employer that there was money to be made as the world lurched closer and closer to all-out war. Having seen firsthand the horrors of Hitler's Reich, he felt it best to throw his lot in with the war effort and to quit his job while still awaiting call-up. 2 days before Britain declared war on Germany, Winton was asked to set up an Air Raid Precautions, or ARP, depot in Hampstead to deal with the inevitable German bombs that were shortly to turn London into a smoking ruin. Instructed to obtain as many vehicles as possible, he assembled a fleet of lorries and lifting gear to deal with damaged buildings, a convoy of smaller cars to whisk the wounded to hospital so that the ambulances were able to take on more serious cases, and a team of first responders and drivers. In February 1940, though, Winton resigned from his post at the ARP, responding to an advert commissioned by the British Red Cross and Order of St. John War Organization, calling for volunteer ambulance drivers abroad. After passing the driving test and medical examination, 10 days later he found himself in France as part of the first unit to be dispatched overseas, which was composed of 25 ambulances, each with 2 drivers, 3 staff cars and 2 trucks. Setting up camp in Vimero, his days now consisted of morning and afternoon parades, ambulance cleaning, and practice convoy runs and mock drills, which he undertook with his fellow volunteers, a motley collection that included several elderly and out-of-shape men. When Nicholas suggested it would be a good idea for them to learn basic first aid on their afternoons off, for despite being ambulance drivers, no one had been given proper medical training, his request was sternly rejected by his commanding officer on the grounds that he didn't believe in first aid. Stuck in an ambulance regiment that didn't even know how to properly administer simple but potentially life-saving treatment, and forced to listen to clueless officers more concerned with their own comfort than carrying out their assignment effectively, Winton and many of his colleagues became disillusioned and frustrated, with only 5 out of the original 50 volunteers remaining by September. This was also partly because in May, Winton's team had been introduced to the realities of war for the first time, having been subjected to an intense aerial bombardment that had lasted for 10 days straight, an incident that he would later recall as the scariest moment of his life. Following the German invasion of the Low Countries, Nicholas and his Red Cross crew attended to the never-ending stream of refugees emanating from Holland and other occupied areas, a column of misery that reminded him of those who he had seen in Prague fleeing the German army. With the Nazis now advancing at a frightening 30 to 50 miles a day, on the 21st of May, Winton and the other Red Cross personnel were ordered to withdraw from their station at Camier Camp and join the glum-faced throngs as they made their way north. Winton eventually returned to Dover, exhausted, bewildered, and deeply questioning the organization and discipline of the Red Cross units after 2 of his commanding officers had simply abandoned them and returned to England without informing them. Despite his misgivings, he worked for the Red Cross for another year and was on call during the iconic 1941 Battle of Britain, as the Royal Air Force and Navy defended Britain from an attempted invasion. Following a brief stint in the Home Guard between April and September of 1942, Nicholas, an experienced pilot, next enlisted for the Royal Air Force in a bid to be closer to the action. But to his dismay, he was rejected because of his poor eyesight. Instead, he became a pilot training instructor, first taking up a posting at the South Cernay Aerodrome, teaching recruits how to night fly, before moving on to La Rochelle in western France in 1944, where he achieved the rank of flight lieutenant. At the end of 1944, as the Germans were retreating, he was appointed second in charge of an RAF exhibition that travelled to Brussels, Paris, Lyon, Oslo, Rotterdam and Prague, designed to show off the might of the British Air Force. The tour was an unqualified success, as attendance exceeded all expectations, with 500,000 turning up in Brussels and 100,000 in Prague, and it also gave Winton the opportunity to view the destruction the war had wrought firsthand, as he travelled from one war-torn town to the next. Having witnessed the agony and pain of those displaced from their homes, brought on by World War II, in 1946, Winton demobilized from the Royal Air Force with the intention of getting himself involved in the post-war rehabilitation and resettlement of refugees. Selected for his past humanitarian work and fluent German, in 1947 he took up employment with the International Refugee Organization, or IRO, relocating to Geneva to become the assistant to Abbe Schwartz, its reparations director. Although on a tax-free salary that was triple the amount he had received in London as a banker, Winton's objective remained wholly humanitarian in nature, and soon he was posted to Frankfurt, where he collaborated with the Vatican City's IRO representative, Father Killian, to arrange the resettlement of approximately 100 displaced families. Months later, Winton was handed the unbelievable task of organizing the sale of Nazi treasure that had been discovered in the American zone of occupation, an assignment that took him on a worldwide whistle-stop tour of Berlin, Bremerhaven, Hamburg, and Bremen, as well as Zurich, Bern, Basel, Paris, and finally to Washington, New York, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and even Manchester. The auction of German treasures he was entrusted to oversee was to play a small part in an overarching operation to sell $25 million of Nazi assets and to gather airless Nazi funds, the profits of which were then to be administered by the Preparatory Commission of the International Refugee Organization, or PCIRO, to aid in the repatriation and rehabilitation of war victims. Winton's role in this titanic mission was to supervise the appraisal, packing, and transformation of metals contained in mountains of personal belongings into bars of gold, an emotionally difficult job which required him to collaborate with many individuals in Germany who had helped in the enforcement of the Holocaust. Winton personally accompanied the first freight load of Nazi loot, composed of 844 cases, stuffed full of silver bowls, candlesticks, rugs, china, and other valuable items, as it was transported from Geneva to Bremerhaven, and recalled the eerie sound of random watch alarms going off as the cargo was being packed onto boats bound for the USA. After this, Winton was given the grim task of organizing the smelting and refining of the precious metals contained in the items that had been forcibly abandoned by victims before they entered the gas chambers, including the extraction of gold fillings found on corpses before their cremation. In 1948, Winton joined the International Bank in Paris, where his main, though seemingly impossible, objective was to ensure that the loans issued to European countries struggling economically in the wake of World War II were not being spent on the military. It was here that he met his future wife, Greta Geertstrup, a 29-year-old Danish woman who was secretary to the European director of the bank. After a short courtship period, the couple fell madly in love, and when Winton asked her to marry him, she is said to have exclaimed without hesitation the words, "Yes, please." In October, they were married in a ceremony that took place in Vejle, Denmark, which had been slightly delayed when the organist, out of respect for the English guests, had played the British national anthem, which the English congregation, led by the groom's steadfast friend Stanley Murdoch, sang proudly, to the amusement of onlookers. What followed was a honeymoon that took the newlyweds on a grand tour of northern France, as well as across the Atlantic to America, where they visited Washington, D.C. to visit the World Bank and to catch up with Winton's old boss, Abba Schwartz, before embarking on a long journey in a rented car to see the sights of New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico, with many stops in between, including a brief foray into Canada, where they tapped maple syrup together in the snow. Having flirted with the prospect of laying down roots in the USA, once back at home, they decided to settle in England, where Nicholas's mother informed her son that a friend she played bridge with was looking for a business partner to develop a factory in Maidenhead, specializing in the manufacture of iced lollipops, an offer that Winton, with much apprehension, decided to take up. Eager to start a family life, in 1950 the couple purchased a house in Maidenhead where their 3 children, Barbara, Nicholas, and Robin, were all born in 1950, 1952, and 1956 respectively. The youngest of their flock, Robin, proved the most challenging, for after 6 months the doctor informed them that their son had been born with Down syndrome, that forced the couple to agonize over what living conditions and arrangements would best suit him and the rest of the family. While the family doctor advised he should be sent away to an institution on the grounds that the disruption to their lives would be irreparable, their friends, knowing how family-orientated they were, implored them to care for him at home, reasoning that it would be a far greater risk to live with the guilt of sending their child away. In the end, Robin, who couldn't walk or speak and required assistance with feeding, was kept at home, becoming a much-loved member of the family who constantly laughed and took pleasure from the smallest things, such as the catching of a ball thrown from his siblings. Winton's mother, however, who did not know how to behave around him, struggled and constantly asked why had it happened to her family. Of his son, who tragically died aged 7 in 1962, Winton remarked, "He gave us an understanding, not only of ourselves, but of others. We learnt a lot from him in his short life. His experience caring for a mentally disabled child left a lasting impression and motivated him to get involved in charitable work, particularly with the National Society for Mentally Handicapped Children, also known as MENCAP, for whom he served as chairman of the local society and as a member of its national committee in his retirement. Meanwhile, in 1958, Winton bought a large plot of land near Maidenhead, where he built the house he lived in until his death, and he further ingratiated himself into the community by joining the local Rotary Club, where he contributed to several altruistic endeavours, such as the organisation of fundraising events, the building of an eye hospital for children in India, and the taking of elderly people out for drives. It was at the Rotary Club that Winton first heard about the Abbeyfield Society, a housing association that provided care and companionship for the elderly, and for which he was able to raise funds for the construction of a care home in Windsor, a building now referred to as Winton House, that accommodates 30 residents. In 1967, Nicholas Winton retired at the age of 58, and for the next 20 or so years devoted himself to MENCAP and Abbeyfield on a voluntary basis, while enjoying in his free time the leisurely pursuits of flying and fencing. In retirement, Winton was able to devote much more time to opera, regularly travelling to London to attend concerts, and sometimes accompanied by a severely disabled friend who shared the same love. The Wintons enjoyed travelling once or twice a year, usually to European countries, with the exception of excursions to Egypt and Tunisia made in their later years. In 1983, he was awarded an MBE for services to the community, and in 1988, he would rise to international prominence when his wife discovered a stack of old papers dating back to his time in Prague, in the attic. In February 1988, Greta Winton was clearing out the attic of their Maidenhead home when she stumbled upon a dusty old scrapbook bearing the names and pictures of several children unknown to her. Ever since the conclusion of affairs in Prague, Nicholas Winton had remained so private about the rescue mission that he hadn't even told his wife, who implored him not to throw the papers away. As Nicholas later explained, "I did not think for one moment that they would be of interest to anyone so long after it happened." Realizing more than her modest husband the significance of these long-forgotten records, Greta contacted Dr. Elizabeth Maxwell, the widow of newspaper tycoon Robert Maxwell, who was so impressed that she commissioned a multi-page feature article about the rescue mission in the Sunday Mirror so that his story could reach millions. On the same day, at the behest of TV presenter Esther Ranson, Winton, now in his 80th year, was invited to appear on a talk show, That's Life, completely unaware that his pivotal role in the evacuation of Jewish children was to be revealed to the nation, and that hundreds of those he had saved would be in the audience. At first, to his surprise, Ranson disclosed that the 3 people sitting next to him were all children he had helped evacuate, before asking other members of the audience to stand up if they also had Winton to thank. When everyone surrounding him got up, Nicholas realized that he was in the midst of a sizable group of individuals who as children had been packed onto his kinder transports and saved from certain death, and Winton, who had thought little of the impact his actions had had, was overwhelmed with emotion and applause. The happiness of that day, however, was somewhat marred by the brutal news that of the 250 children prevented from leaving Prague the day Hitler invaded Poland, none had survived the war. Winton's exploits were spread far and wide by a spate of further features and publicity, with the number of his children identified rising to over 150, as floods of letters and phone calls were received from those eager to meet their rescuer. A meeting of survivors was organized at an international scholars' conference entitled Remembering for the Future, set up by Dr. Maxwell, with Winton's children flying in from as far as the United States, Israel, and New Zealand to take part in this happy reunion. Soon after, Nicholas, now affectionately referred to as Nicky, was presented with a collection of letters and photos from them, their own version of the scrapbook that his wife had so unexpectedly rediscovered. Ever uncomfortable with being worshipped as a hero, Winton explained, "I didn't want thanks. It is enough to know that you are alive, that you are happy and well, that you are making the best of your lives. My one regret is that I could not have saved more." For the rest of his years, Winton was regularly visited by his children, inundated by requests inviting him to their homes, and was the recipient of many moving letters of thanks from those eternally grateful to have been given a second chance. In May 1989, Nicholas and Greta Winton hopped on a plane to Israel to submit the original records of the rescue mission to the Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority at Yad Vashem, an excursion of momentous importance that was financed and organized by the Maxwells. There, they were greatly moved by the memorial to the children who had perished during the Holocaust and the somber recitation of all 1.5 million victims' names that took place in the windowless and silent hall that housed the cenotaph. Afterwards, they were much gladdened to attend the gathering of those children who had started new lives in Israel, a group which included Amos Ben Ron and his wife Gabby, the only two of his young charges, to marry each other. Towards the end of the year, Nicholas received a letter from one of his children, Hugo Marom, a famed Czech fighter pilot, informing him that he had applied for him to be recognized by Israel as a righteous Gentile, a non-Jew who had risked their own lives to save Jewish men, women, and children. Ever modest, Winton decided not to accept the honor, citing that his life had not been endangered during those difficult months in 1939, and that because his paternal grandparents had been German Jews, he could not possibly satisfy all the conditions the honor demanded, principally because by blood he was also a Jew. For Winton, the most gratifying prize remained keeping in touch and meeting up with his cherished children. He gathered in June of 1989 with a crowd of over 10,000 former child refugees, comprising of Nicholas's own children, some of whom he had never met, as well as others saved by different organizations for the international reunion of the Kindertransport, a gathering that celebrated the 50th anniversary of the children's arrival to Britain. In June 1990, following the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Abernant Hotel in Wales was chosen as the venue to host a second reunion, an event in which several former children who had moved back to Czechoslovakia after the war were able to introduce themselves for the first time to Nicholas and Greta, owing to the relaxation of travel restrictions that had been previously imposed on them by their former communist government. With the collapse of the Iron Curtain, in May 1991, he visited Prague for only the third time in his life, being greeted at the airport by his Czech-based children throwing armfuls of flowers and by representatives of the Jewish community who insisted that the Wintons do them the honor of being their guests. Instead, however, Nicholas and Greta were checked into the Hotel Europa, formerly Hotel Schrubeck, where over 50 years previously he had met his old schoolmaster Martin Blake to fatefully embark on his now legendary rescue mission. During his remarkable 12-day trip, Nicholas was given many accolades, including the freedom of the city of Prague by the mayor, but when asked by reporters what had pleased him, he replied unswervingly, to see all the children doing well, being glad to be alive. Back in the UK, he was the recipient of many more awards, becoming the first person from the Maidenhead branch of the Rotary Club to be handed the Paul Harris Fellowship Commendation, one of the highest honours in the organisation, while 9 years later he was lauded with the Service Above Self Award by Rotary International, which is only given to 150 people worldwide every year. In 1997, he would again be back in the spotlight when Slovakian director Matej Minac, working on a film that traced the disintegration of a pre-war Jewish family from Bohemia entitled All My Loved Ones, asked Nicholas for permission to use his name and story in a section of the movie, an offer which Winton, never one to be the centre of attention, reluctantly accepted. So moved was Minac by the tale of the Kindertransports that the next year in March he started shooting a full-length documentary about the tale, which was recounted by Winton in a series of interviews conducted in Hotel Europa. During this fifth trip to Prague, for he had visited in June 1995 for the third reunion of the children, he attended a banquet in his honour at the British Embassy and delivered a speech at the city's Jewish Museum to a packed hall. Arriving back in Heathrow after another intense week of adulation, an exhausted Winton was relieved not to be met by a cheering crowd, reportedly saying, "Thank goodness they don't make such a fuss here in England. I couldn't take any more. I need a holiday to get over the past week." A couple of weeks later, Winton got his wish when he travelled to France with his wife to embark on a tour with his friends. But this particular vacation would be one to forget, when Greta suddenly collapsed and was rushed to hospital. Here Nicholas learnt that his sweetheart of nearly half a century had been diagnosed with cancer, and after several weeks in hospital, Greta returned to England a shadow of her former self, but determined to fight her disease. Like he had done with Robin before, Nicholas resolved to care for his dying wife and to spend as much time as possible with her until the end. With the doctor advising them not to look too far ahead, a huge party to celebrate Nicholas's 90th birthday and Greta's 80th, planned for the spring of 1999, was cancelled, as her condition began to significantly deteriorate. Despite this, they still went ahead and commemorated their 50th wedding anniversary in October 1998 with their friends and family. A get-together that not only doubled as a celebration of their birthdays, but also as a chance to say goodbye to Greta, who, despite being frail and thin, had a smile that never left her face that day. On the 28th of October, with the blessing of Greta, who was adamant he should go, Nicholas, accompanied by his son of the same name, went to Prague to receive the highest honour of the Czech Republic, the Tomáš Garik Masaryk Order, from its president Václav Havel, at a grand ceremony held at Hradčany Castle. In February 1999, with Greta's cancer not spreading as quickly as predicted, Winton and his wife attended a function where he was awarded the honorary freedom of the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, an accolade that made him a member of an exclusive club that included the likes of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and the Duke of Edinburgh, and which would be their last official public appearance as a couple. In June 1999, with Greta bedbound and not at his side, Winton spent time with many of his children at the second London reunion of the Kindertransports, which marked the 60th anniversary of the rescue mission. On the 28th of August 1999, Greta passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving Nicholas, who spent the rest of his unusually long life without her, completely and utterly devastated. Despite the heartache, he dealt with his grief admirably and continued to appear in public and spread his story just as Greta would have wanted him to do. In October 1999, he attended the Prague premiere of Matej Minac's All My Loved Ones to watch Rupert Graves portray him on the silver screen, with the crowd roused to a standing ovation by the power of the British actor's performance. Close to tears, Winton turned to his close friend and said, "If only Greta had lived to be here with me." In 2000, a documentary about Winton's rescue mission, entitled Into the Arms of Strangers, co-written by one of his children, Vera Gissing, was released and went on to win an Academy Award. Now 91 years old, during his twilight years, Nicholas Winton, lauded as Britain's Schindler by Tony Blair in 2002, became an integral part of British remembrances of the Holocaust, and was knighted in 2003 for his tireless, lifelong crusade to spread the word of the horrific consequences of racism. In 2004, he was again honoured by the Czech government with a Class I Medal of the Order of the White Lion. In 2009, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2010, he was bestowed the British Hero of the Holocaust Award by Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Throughout proceedings, Winton expressed customary humility, going to great pains to emphasize that his colleagues Doreen Warrener and Trevor Chadwick risked even more than him by staying behind in Prague as the Nazis advanced. On the 1st of July 2015, at the age of 106, Nicholas Winton died of heart failure at Wexham Park Hospital in Berkshire. A private funeral for family and friends was held at Chilton's Crematorium in Maidenhead, and in May 2016, a public memorial service attended by 400 people, including many of his children and representatives of the British, Czech and Slovakian governments, was organized to celebrate the life of a man who personified selflessness, modesty, and service. Born to a well-to-do family, Nicholas Winton had a privileged upbringing, being raised as a Christian by German Jewish parents who wished to integrate him better into British society. As a boy, he attended Stowe, a Christian-orientated institution that was one of Britain's leading private schools, and where his love of fencing and mathematics was sparked by two influential teachers. Out of term time, Nicholas enjoyed many of the pastimes of the upper middle class, attending operas and plays, going on vacation to Belgium and other countries, and playing billiards and table tennis with his best friend Stanley Murdoch. At 16, just before he entered the workplace as a trainee banker, Winton chose to turn his back on his ancestral religion in favor of his adopted religion, opting to marry a Christian girl when the time was right. After working briefly at the military bank in London, he moved to Hamburg, where he mastered the German language, developed a lively social life, and kept up correspondence with his first love, Elizabeth O'Malley. During the 1930s, Winton steadily advanced up the ranks, becoming a member of the London Stock Exchange in 1937, by which point he had become aware of the worsening situation for Jews in Nazi Germany, thanks to his old schoolmaster Martin Blake, who had invited him to attend meetings at the Peace Pledge Union, and the reams of relatives he had witnessed flocking to the family's home in Hampstead to stay permanently. Nicholas felt compelled to help others in any way he could, so when Martin Blake urged him to cancel his skiing trip and to accompany him on a special mission in Prague, he unhesitatingly accepted the call. Arriving in Christmas 1938, for the next 7 months, Winton used every lesson he had learned in his professional career to efficiently unite and organize the disparate voluntary organizations tasked with finding new homes for the swathes of Jewish refugees who had fled to Prague. In 1939, he oversaw the resettlement of 669 endangered children to Britain, before returning to his homeland to pitch in with the war. It would only be decades later that he realized the true significance of it. He worked for the International Bank in Paris, where he met Greta Gyelstrup, asking her to marry him after a brief courtship period. While Nicholas worked as an executive of an iced lolly factory in Maidenhead, The couple produced 3 children: Barbara, Nicholas, and finally Robin, who tragically died aged 7 due to complications with Down syndrome. In 1967, Winton retired at 58, and for the next 20 years led a leisurely existence, devoting himself to charitable work, the opera, and travel, which was turned upside down in 1988 when clearing out the attic, Greta chanced upon a scrapbook with the names, pictures, and details of hundreds of children, a discovery that revealed her husband's part in the Kindertransports. With the financial backing of the Maxwell family, Winton's story became known to millions, thanks to publicity from various media organizations, outliving his beloved wife by 16 years, until his death at the age of 106 in 2015. Winton dedicated himself to charitable work, Holocaust awareness, and maintained affectionate relationships with many of his children, catching up with them at numerous international meetings, paying them personal visits, or hosting them himself in his Maidenhead home. What do you think of Nicholas Winton? How big an impact do you think his life and story had on the spreading of awareness of the Holocaust in the post-war era? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.